How did Canada go from having the third largest navy in the world during World War II to ranking only 23rd today? During World War II, Canadian ships patrolled the Atlantic theater. Our Navy hunted U-boats, we flew at Lancasters, and we made factories to build them. Now we're accused of free riding in NATO, underfunding our military and leaving our own shores to be defended by someone else, mostly the United States. Is that fair to say, or is Canada unwilling to sacrifice over sovereignty for spending? Like most of Europe, Canada's spending on equipment and personnel slid after World War I. We didn't have enough boats, or tanks, or planes. Once the threat of war became real, Canada joined the war effort and rapidly increased our spending. Our naval fleet grew from 40 vessels to 400 by the end of World War II. We spent a lot of money helping defend Europe against Germany, but we also shipped and sold to Europe as a safe space to produce goods without the Luftwaffe flying overhead. We got to work. Not to mention our shipping route was direct to Russia, avoiding Germany altogether. So to say that we did spend on our military is a bit misleading. Did we spend money? Yes. But did we spend the kind of money required to build up our defense against potential threats? Certainly not. It's not even entirely true that we had the third largest navy, fourth by some accounts. Well, it is true that by the end of World War II, we had a brief moment where we possessed just enough ships to call ourselves the third or fourth largest navy. But not that if you include that by tonnage. By number of vessels, only did Canada ever have the largest navy, and only for a short period of time. It's not the size of the boat that matters, it's how you use it. Calling ourselves the fourth largest navy implies that we had the fortitude to spend the buckets and buckets of money on defense required to properly protect ourselves, and then somehow lost it. In the bigger picture, we could also say we never had it. Prior to any real threat, we let our military forces dwindle. When Germany invaded Poland, we trained our soldiers with World War I tanks that the British were ready to retire, and when we got to the front, we used the British tanks. Yes, all of Europe was ill-prepared for the secret fleet that Germany had built, but our allies were better prepared. During World War II, our war production, we spent $10 billion. By the end of the war, we were the fourth largest producer of war materials and supplies. Our products included chemical, biological weaponry, jet propulsion, rocketry, medical supplies, planes, tanks, as well. We were involved in atomic research. Immediately following World War II, Canada continued defense spending and transitioned to a post-war climate under Louis St. Laurent. The same principles of bits and pieces from GM's former turned defense minister continued. What did change drastically was how much other countries could produce themselves. They didn't have to buy everything from us. We didn't adopt the same philosophy after World War II as we did after World War I. For almost a decade, we learned from our mistakes and we participated in defense. Canada was one of the 12 founding countries of NATO. We were also fully aligned with the U.S. When asked to join Korea, we said yes. The ideological fault lines of the Cold War against communists of the USSR were firmly established, and we chose a side.
Under a single command, to hold the aggressors at bay.
Which meant war spending continued. The war machine of the U.S. that was created during World War II and the Manhattan Project was full steam ahead. The founding principles of NATO are an alliance to protect one another's sovereignty by swearing a strong military allegiance. After World War II, the borders were declared permanent. Never again was another country in Europe to invade another for territory under the Articles of the United Nations. Hypothetically, one Eastern Empire might try to invade a neighboring country. Looking at you, Russia. NATO was the greatest insurance policy against a future invasion, which only works if you're continually armed against a potential enemy and not easily blitzkrieged by a handful of tanks. But NATO was never really just about defending against an invasion. It was a pact against the spread of communists. In the immediate years after World War II, Churchill declared the Iron Curtain of Soviet rule.
From Stettin in the Baltic
But the Russians had
to
not
Trieste in the Adriatic,
They retained
an
overwhelming
iron
the
curtain has
largest force in Europe.
descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals.
And the unofficial declaration of the Cold War fearing nuclear power. Churchill saw a future pact between the U.S., Great Britain, and Canada. By 1947, 2 years before the formation of NATO and 3 years after the defeat in Normandy, Churchill had accepted that an alliance between Russia, Britain, and the U.S. would not last.
But the Russians had not demobilized. They retained overwhelmingly the largest force in Europe.
With Germany out of the way, the USSR was free to pursue what it set to accomplish: Bolshevik revolution. A new world order was forming, and at its center was the most powerful and devastating weapon in history, the atomic bomb. Always a realist, Churchill accepted that sharing the technology between the US, Canada, and Great Britain was better than letting the Americans alone possess such a powerful weapon.
It would nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, be wrong and imprudent to entrust the secret knowledge or experience of the atomic bomb, which the United States, Great Britain, and Canada now share, to the world organization while it is still in its infancy. It would be criminal madness to cast it adrift in this still agitated and ununited world.
When the fifth column of communist expansion reached Korea, NATO tested its resolve when almost all 12 members joined forces. Canada continued its investment in NATO, agreed to nuclear armament with the US, and developed our own defensive weapons. The election of Diefenbaker. The defeat of Louis Saint Laurent to Diefenbaker was a cataclysmic shift in ideology and in our relationship to the US. The Prime Minister from Saskatchewan had no interest in the war machine or defense spending. While the Americans moved further into the Cold War, Canada implemented universal health care under Diefenbaker. We also severed ties with the US and killed our aerospace program that never recovered. You cannot discuss Diefenbaker without discussing the Avro Arrow. During World War II, Canada built planes, tanks from British designs, including the highly advanced Lancaster bomber at Victory Aircraft in Ontario. In 1945, the AV Row bought Victory Aircraft and formed the Canadian division of Avro. The golden age of Canadian aerospace was in full swing. In 1953, Saint Laurent and the Liberals commissioned Canada's first cutting-edge aerospace project. It was designed by and built by Canadians. When the Avro Arrow was ready for production in 1959, Parliament had undergone a regime change, and Diefenbaker couldn't justify the continued spending. In a day known as Black Friday, Diefenbaker killed the program under the justification that it was an interceptor aircraft designed to intercept bombers from the USSR. The Avro Arrow was one of the most advanced interceptor aircraft in the world, but Russians pivoted away from manned aircraft to missiles, such as the ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. While the Avro Arrow was in the test phase, Diefenbaker canceled the program. This exact moment defined our military aerospace history. Forget our reputation as gentle Canadians. Canadian engineers were furious, and after Diefenbaker abandoned the project, they abandoned Canada. The Americans happily recruited all our best and brightest engineers. In 1962, the Avro Company was dissolved. Diefenbaker's ideological shift didn't end with the Avro program. He clashed with the Americans and had a bitter relationship with Kennedy, who came to power in 1960. Immediately following the Cuban Revolution, Batista was not fully displaced from power when Diefenbaker considered selling weapons to Fidel. We were one of the first to recognize the new communist government under Castro. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Diefenbaker refused to raise the alert to DEFCON 3. Diefenbaker defied American sanctions and doubled grain exports to Cuba. During the American embargoes, our trade with Cuba went from $13 million to $24.5 million and asserted Canada's sovereignty against the American will. To call this a thorn in the American side is an understatement. Kennedy was so bristled. CIA documents later revealed that Kennedy left behind a document outlining plans to embargo Canada. Kennedy's inner circle was ready to sanction Canada as rumors of Castro's men visiting Toronto to acquire weapons. Diefenbaker made no attempt to warn the Americans, and their relationship turned from bad to worse. Kennedy rebuffed Diefenbaker's invite to an event, and instead invited his liberal opponent, Lester B. Pearson. The CIA interference in elections, upon their insult, ran. Following the failed Bay of Pigs, Kennedy became increasingly wary of the American industrial military complex. He doubted his own advisors as war-hungry generals, but never softened his stance towards Diefenbaker.
In Cuba of 1961, we picked the wrong one. Secretary of State who had to advise on the attitude of the OAS and NATO, so that, in my opinion, the majority came to accept the course we finally took. It made it much easier. The Cuba of 1961, the advice of those who were brought in on the executive branch was also unanimous, and the advice was wrong.
Diefenbaker paid a price for asserting his independence against the giant to the south. While nothing was ever officially declassified, Diefenbaker insisted that the CIA meddled in our elections. A first-hand report was published 50 years after JFK's assassination by a pollster who visited Canada with the intention of defeating Diefenbaker with new research methods. 500 women were employed to gather research using sampling methods developed after the baffling Eisenhower election that gave Pearson new ways to persuade Canadians. Any other wrongdoing was never admitted, and the files were destroyed. Pearson allowed the U.S. to store nuclear missiles on Canadian soil, but by the late 60s, support for NATO in Europe and Canada declined. France took a step back and never fully trusted the U.S. to come to their aid. Canadians became disillusioned with blind support for the American agenda. Unable to keep up the defense costs on nuclear jets and other upgrades, Trudeau, who succeeded Pearson, dramatically cut spending on NATO. New programs never materialized to make a substitute. The Americans outspent any NATO allies, and quite frankly, Canada isn't entirely sure who it's aligned with: Americans, Great Britain, Europe, Asia, let alone their own interests. After the collapse of the USSR in 91,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And other regime change in Ottawa from Mulroney conservatives to Chrétien liberals, Canada adopts a policy of insularism, protected by oceans on the east, west, and the north, and the friendliest border in the world to the south. There is little threat of a real invasion. Globally, an era of peace was enjoyed by most of the world. Gorbachev visited the West, and Russia even joined the G8. Without a real enemy and no Canadian companies to benefit from the investment, military spending became a costly and seemingly unnecessary expense. Even the War on Terror couldn't incentivize Canadian spending on defense. Our heroic but underfunded Navy mothballed from its previous status. What remains of our antique war chest has mostly been donated to Ukraine. In the 90s, most of NATO agreed to invest in the development of a new fighter jet. It only took 30 years, but the F-35 has finally been developed. Under the second Trudeau, the Liberals begrudgingly agreed to buy 88 shiny new fighter jets from American contractor Lockheed Martin. After a failed bidding war to spur investment in Canada, our tax dollars will go entirely to the U.S. If only there was a Canadian company to benefit from this investment. However, nothing scares up military spending like a real threat. Europe has kicked into high gear against the fear of invasion from Russia. Underspending in NATO has become the norm, but almost overnight, even our European counterparts are getting annoyed with our mothballed Navy and air defense. And it isn't just NATO that we have to satisfy. As the Arctic is melting, the northern shipping route is open and accessible with new threats that we are completely unequipped to deal with. We currently have 7 people stationed at our most northern station. When a weather balloon entered our airspace in 2023, Canada claims we didn't want to shoot it down and were happy to observe. But even if we wanted to, it was flying 10,000 meters above the capability of our most advanced Hornet fighter jet. We collected surveillance until it floated into American airspace, where they immediately shot it down and collected the remnants. Doesn't exactly instill confidence. Our biggest threat currently exists in the north, and Americans are frustrated that they'll have to defend our airspace for us and the rest of NATO. They claim that the world has become a charity case for the military. But back to the original question we posed, is that a fair complaint? Canadians are being asked to spend buckets of money on projects that we may or may not want, that will go almost entirely to the US. Do we have the right to insist that the contract go to the company that will build at least part of them in Canada? Donald Trump is threatening, among other things, that if we buy Gripens from European Saab instead of fulfilling our promise to buy the F-35s from Lockheed Martin, that he'll punish us through CUMSA negotiations. So yet again, we're supposed to do whatever the Americans want, or we get punished. In times like this, it's a good time to ask, what would Churchill say? At the close of World War II, Churchill was determined not to repeat the same mistakes that Europeans made in World War I. He imagined 100 years of peace, and it all hinged on a strong United Nations with a sheriff like NATO to reinforce peace. Above all else, he respected the sovereignty of individual countries. It was Churchill who worked tirelessly to engage the Americans in the European theater when they didn't see why it was their problem. When it was time to fight, Churchill rallied people to a cause. And when it was time for peace, he valued compromise. Canada has always belonged to the British Commonwealth. But Churchill saw Canada as an important neighbor to the US. Our industriousness impressed the British when we were asked to build weapons, and when the war was over, they kept those factories open under a Canadian division. Canada's reputation is one of bravery, and we're always there to stand up for what's right. There was a rupture in our relationship to the US during Kennedy, and there's a rupture now.
We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
This is an opportunity to reinvigorate our defense contracts and establish our sovereignty in a new era. Allied relationships are not easy, but we will find a way forward. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.